Imagine being born with a destiny so powerful that it was foretold before your very existence. Samson's story doesn't begin with his mighty strength or his battles against the Philistines. It begins with a promise, a divine intervention, a moment where God himself chose a man before he even took his first breath. The Israelites were suffering under the oppression of the Philistines, a cruel and dominant enemy who had kept them under their rule for 40 years. The people of Israel, despite their constant cycle of rebellion and repentance, cried out for deliverance, and in response God set his plan into motion. But instead of raising up a warrior in the traditional sense, he chose to begin with a miracle, a child born to a barren woman, destined to be the one who would challenge their oppressors. One day an angel of the Lord appeared to a woman whose name is never mentioned in the Bible, but whose role was crucial in God's plan. She had no children until this moment. The angel told her that she would conceive a son, but he would not be just any child. He would be set apart from birth. He was to be a Nazirite, a man dedicated to God in a sacred vow that required him to abstain from wine, never touch anything unclean, and most importantly, never cut his hair. This vow wasn't just a tradition, it was a symbol, a mark of divine calling. Overwhelmed, she ran to tell her husband, Manoah, who, instead of doubting, pleaded with God for more guidance. He wanted to understand how to raise this child properly, to ensure he fulfilled his divine purpose. And once again the angel returned, reaffirming the sacred mission that awaited their son. This wasn't just about Samson's strength, it was about his obedience. His connection to God was supposed to be the true source of his power. And so, Samson was born into a world where he was set apart before he even took his first steps. He was meant to be the answer to Israel's suffering, the warrior who would begin the work of delivering God's people. His parents surely raised him with the knowledge that he was no ordinary man, that his life had been chosen for something greater. But from the very beginning, we see the tension that would define Samson's life. A man gifted with extraordinary strength, yet constantly struggling with his own desires. His story was always meant to be about more than just raw power. It was about purpose, about the weight of a calling, about what happens when someone who is chosen by God walks the dangerous line between obedience and self-indulgence. And as Samson grew, so did his potential, but so did his weaknesses. Would he rise to his divine purpose, or would his own desires lead him to destruction? His journey was only beginning. As Samson grew into a man, his reputation must have spread throughout Israel. He was unlike anyone else, a man of immense strength, chosen by God himself. But here's the thing about Samson. While his physical power was unmatched, his spiritual discipline was shaky, and that would be his downfall. From the very beginning, Samson's greatest weakness wasn't his enemies, it was his own desires. And we see the first glimpse of this when he makes a decision that sets the stage for his future failures. Samson, instead of looking for a wife among his own people, sets his eyes on a Philistine woman in the town of Timnah. This was not just a casual mistake. The Philistines were Israel's oppressors, their sworn enemies, and yet Samson, Israel's supposed deliverer, was drawn to them, not in battle, but in love. It wasn't about strategy or diplomacy, it was about impulse. He saw her, found her attractive, and decided that she was the one he wanted. When he returned home, he told his parents, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." His parents were horrified. They tried to reason with him, asking, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But Samson was stubborn. He demanded, "Get her for me, she is right in my eyes." This moment is crucial. It reveals something fundamental about Samson's character. Instead of seeking God's guidance, instead of valuing wisdom, he followed his own desires. He saw, he wanted, he took. And that pattern, one of impulse-driven decisions, would follow him for the rest of his life. What Samson didn't realize was that his actions weren't just about himself. He was supposed to be Israel's leader, their hope for deliverance. Yet he was walking straight into the arms of the enemy, quite literally. This wasn't just about love, it was about allegiance. He was meant to be different, set apart for God's purpose. But instead he was blending in, chasing after what looked good in his own eyes rather than what was right in God's eyes. And here's the irony. God, in his sovereignty, would still use even Samson's flaws for his greater purpose. The Bible tells us that God allowed this situation as part of his plan against the Philistines. But that doesn't excuse Samson's disobedience. It only highlights how God can work even through human failures. Samson's choice led to a chain reaction of events, encounters with wild animals, betrayals, and eventually a wedding that turned into disaster. But all of it started here, with a simple, selfish decision. He had the strength of 100 men. But did he have the strength to control himself? The warning signs were already there, and the cost of ignoring them would be devastating. Samson's story takes a dramatic turn when he sets out to claim his Philistine bride in Timnah. But along the way, something strange happens, something that should have served as a wake-up call, a moment to stop and reflect. Instead, it became another step in his dangerous pattern of recklessness. As Samson was traveling through the vineyards of Timnah, a young lion suddenly appeared and attacked him. Now this wasn't just any encounter. This was a moment where God's power surged through Samson. Without any weapons, without any armor, he grabbed the lion with his bare hands and tore it apart, as if it were nothing more than a small goat. Imagine the sheer strength, the raw power. It was an unmistakable sign that God was with him. But what did Samson do next? Did he take a moment to acknowledge God's power in his life? Did he humble himself in gratitude or seek God's wisdom for the path ahead? No. Instead, he kept the event to himself. He didn't tell his parents. He didn't reflect on what it might mean. He just moved on, as if nothing had happened. This was a defining moment in Samson's life. God had given him an incredible gift, strength beyond human capability. But Samson treated it casually, almost carelessly. He had been set apart by God, a Nazirite from birth, meant to follow strict vows, including one that forbade him from touching anything dead. And yet sometime later, when Samson was passing by the same road, he saw the carcass of the lion. What he did next was shocking. Inside the carcass, bees had made a hive, and Samson, instead of recoiling from the dead body as his vow required, reached in, scooped out some honey and ate it. He even gave some to his parents without telling them where it came from. It was a small act of defiance, but it revealed something deeply troubling. Samson didn't take his calling seriously. He wasn't just breaking a rule, he was treating his own consecration as if it were meaningless. And then, as if to mock the situation, he decided to turn this moment into a game. At his wedding feast, surrounded by Philistines, Samson posed a riddle to them. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. It was a clever puzzle, but it was more than that. It was a symbol of how Samson saw his life. He played with the very things that should have been warning signs. He treated his strength, his calling, and even his compromises like they were part of some grand game. The Philistines, frustrated and unable to solve the riddle, resorted to threats. They pressured Samson's new wife to find the answer, and after much pleading, she got him to reveal the secret. And just like that, Samson's own arrogance became his downfall. The Philistines answered his riddle, and Samson, furious at being deceived, stormed out and killed 30 men just to settle the score. This moment was pivotal. Instead of recognizing the warning signs, his disregard for his vows, his reckless treatment of his calling, his impulsive rage, Samson doubled down on his path of destruction. He had been playing with fire, and soon he would get burned. What Samson didn't realize was that his strength wasn't his to wield as he pleased. It was a gift from God, meant to serve a purpose greater than himself. But Samson wasn't thinking about purpose. He was thinking about himself. And that would cost him dearly. This is where Samson's story takes its most infamous turn. The mighty warrior, undefeated in battle, feared by his enemies, and blessed with supernatural strength, meets the one person who would ultimately bring him down. Not a soldier, not a king, but a woman named Delilah. Now Samson had already shown a dangerous pattern of weakness when it came to women. He had pursued a Philistine wife against his parents' advice. He had visited a prostitute in Gaza, and now he became entangled with Delilah, a woman whose loyalty was not to him, but to his enemies. The Philistine rulers saw an opportunity. They approached Delilah with a deal. If she could find out the secret of Samson's strength and betray him, they would each give her a massive sum of silver. For Delilah, the choice was easy. For Samson, this was the moment that would determine his fate. Delilah began her mission with subtlety, using charm and affection. "Tell me the secret of your strength," she asked, "and how you can be tied up and subdued." Now Samson could have walked away. He could have recognized the danger. But instead, he played along, treating it like another game, just as he had with the Philistines and the riddle. He gave her a false answer, saying that if he were tied with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would become as weak as any other man. That very night, Delilah bound him while he slept, and when she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," he snapped the bowstrings as if they were nothing. It was a test and he passed, but instead of learning from it, he stayed. Delilah tried again. This time, Samson told her that new ropes would make him powerless. Once again, she tested him, and once again, he broke free. Still, he remained. By the third time, Delilah was pressing him harder, pleading with him, manipulating his emotions. She was relentless, and yet Samson still resisted, giving another false answer about weaving his hair into a loom. But each test was wearing him down. He was playing with fire, getting closer and closer to the truth, like a man walking along the edge of a cliff, thinking he would never fall. Finally, Delilah broke him. She nagged, she pleaded. She wore him down to the point where he was sick to death of her persistence. And in a moment of exhaustion, frustration, and arrogance, Samson revealed the truth. He told her everything. "My strength has never left me because I have been set apart to God from birth. If my head were shaved, I would become as weak as any other man." This was it, the moment of no return. Samson had just handed over the key to his downfall, and that night, as he slept on Delilah's lap, she called in the Philistines and they shaved his head. When Delilah called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," he woke up thinking he would shake himself free as before. But this time, something was different. The Bible records one of the most haunting verses in Samson's story. He did not know that the Lord had left him. That was the real tragedy. Not just that his hair was gone, but that he had broken the last strand of his consecration. His strength had never come from his hair, it had come from God. And now God's power had departed from him. The Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They bound him with bronze shackles, and they took him to Gaza, the very place where he had once ripped the city gates from the ground. Now he was their prisoner, reduced to grinding grain in the darkness of a prison. Samson had spent his life treating his strength as if it were his own to use as he pleased. He had ignored warning after warning. He had broken vow after vow. And now, for the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. His strength was gone, his freedom was gone, his sight was gone, and yet his story wasn't over. Imagine this: the man once feared by an entire nation, the warrior who single-handedly tore apart Philistine armies, now shackled like a common prisoner. But not just any prisoner. Samson had been utterly humiliated. The Philistines didn't just capture him. They wanted to break him completely, to turn the once mighty judge of Israel into a living symbol of their dominance. And so, they gouged out his eyes. Think about that for a moment. For all of Samson's life, his eyes had been his weakness. It was his sight that led him to desire a Philistine wife against God's will. It was his eyes that caused him to pursue sinful relationships. Again and again, Samson had let his own desires override his calling. And now those very eyes were taken from him. This wasn't just a punishment, it was poetic justice. But the humiliation didn't stop there. The Philistines didn't kill Samson outright. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, they dragged him to Gaza, the very place where, in his arrogance, he had once ripped the city gates from the ground and carried them away. Now, he was led back in chains, blind and helpless, as the crowds jeered at him. They shackled him in bronze chains and put him to work grinding grain in the prison mill, a job reserved for the lowest of slaves. Samson, the champion of Israel, reduced to walking in circles, pushing a grinding stone day after day in complete darkness. Can you imagine the agony of that? The physical pain of his wounds, the absolute loss of control, the deafening silence, where once there was the voice of God's Spirit empowering him. The memories of every mistake replaying over and over in his mind. But here's what's remarkable. This wasn't just a moment of suffering, it was a moment of transformation. For the first time in his life, Samson was truly powerless. No more battles to fight, no more enemies to defeat, no more women to chase. Just solitude, silence, and suffering. And in that darkness, something incredible happened. The Bible says, "But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." Now, let's be clear. Samson's strength never came from his hair. His strength came from his vow to God, and that vow had been broken. But here's the thing. God wasn't finished with him yet. Day by day, as his hair grew back, perhaps something else was growing too. Humility, dependence, a realization that all his life he had been given a gift, a divine calling, and he had squandered it. And so the stage was being set. Because Samson's story wasn't going to end in chains, it wasn't going to end in humiliation. No, God was about to give him one last chance, one final moment, one ultimate stand. And this time, Samson would not fight for himself. This time he would fight for God. The air inside the massive temple of Dagon was thick with the smell of incense, sweat, and spilled wine. The Philistines had gathered in celebration, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. This was no ordinary festival. This was a victory, feast, a mockery of Israel's fallen champion. And there, at the very center of it all, stood Samson. Or rather, he was dragged into the temple like a trophy of war. The once mighty warrior, the man who had slain 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, now nothing more than a spectacle for the amusement of his enemies. Thousands of Philistine nobles, lords, and commoners filled the temple, crowding its balconies, shouting insults and hurling food at him. To them, Samson wasn't just a prisoner. He was living proof that their god, Dagon, was greater than the God of Israel. "Bring out Samson," someone roared. "Let him entertain us." And so, blind and bound, Samson was led forward, forced to perform for his captors. Imagine the humiliation, the jeers, the laughter. The man who once tore a lion apart with his bare hands now stumbling like a fool before the Philistine elite. But here's what they didn't know. As they mocked, Samson was praying. As they jeered, something deep within him was stirring. He could feel the rough stone beneath his feet, the cold iron of the chains that bound his wrists. But beyond the physical, there was something else. Something he had not felt in a long time. A whisper in his spirit. A calling. And then, an idea. He turned to the servant boy who had led him into the temple. "Put my hands on the pillars that support the temple," Samson said, his voice steady. "Let me lean on them." Now, why would the Philistines allow this? Because they thought he was broken, weak, powerless. But what they didn't realize was that this would be the last mistake they would ever make, because Samson wasn't finished yet. This moment of absolute humiliation, was about to become the most powerful moment of his life. Imagine the scene. Samson, blind and shackled, stands in the heart of the pagan temple, surrounded by thousands of Philistine lords, kings, and commoners. The noise is deafening. Laughter, shouts, and the sounds of celebration fill the air as the crowd watches him with contempt. For the first time in his life, Samson is truly vulnerable. His once godly strength, the source of his pride and his power, has been reduced to nothing. The chains that bind him symbolize everything he's lost: his freedom, his dignity, his purpose. The pride that once propelled him forward is now crushed beneath the weight of his failure. And yet, in this moment of absolute despair, Samson's heart begins to stir. Deep within him there is a flicker of hope, a spark of his former faith. He knows that without God's strength he is nothing. It was this same strength that once tore the lion apart, that struck down his enemies, and now he is about to face his greatest battle yet, the battle for his soul, his redemption, and his legacy. Samson had failed, there was no doubt about that. He had been disobedient, reckless, and prideful. He had forsaken his vows, his covenant with God. But as he stood there, shackled in humiliation, he realized that it was never too late to return. With his head bowed, Samson whispered a prayer. God, remember me. Strengthen me just once more. Let me die with the Philistines, but let my death be a victory for your name. In that moment, Samson didn't ask for deliverance from his chains, nor did he plead for freedom from his enemies. No, he asked for one last act of strength, one final victory to show that God's power could never be defeated, even in the darkest hour. This prayer is powerful, not just because it was Samson's last, but because it showed the depth of his brokenness and the return of his humility. He was no longer the proud warrior who had thought he could do everything on his own. In the darkness of the temple, with death looming and his enemies laughing, Samson's heart turned back to God. And in that moment, God heard him. We often think that when we fall, it's too late to come back. That when we sin, we've gone too far and redemption is out of reach. But Samson's prayer shows us that even in our deepest failures, God is willing to hear us if we turn back to Him with a repentant heart. Samson's story teaches us that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is greater. This was not just a prayer of strength, it was a prayer of restoration, of acknowledging that in the end, all that matters is God's will. And even in the face of death, Samson had the courage to ask God for one final chance to fulfill his purpose. The moment had arrived. Samson, blind and broken, stood before the pillars of the Philistine temple, his enemies roaring in celebration. The once mighty judge of Israel, the man who had torn lions apart with his bare hands and slain 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, was now a shadow of his former self. But in his heart something had changed. Samson, in his darkest hour, understood that this was no longer about his strength. It was about his obedience to God. He had tried for so long to do things his way, trusting in his own power, relying on his own understanding. But now, facing the end of his life, he realized that true strength came not from within, but from God alone. Samson's final act was not just a physical act of strength, it was the ultimate test of his faith. The weight of the entire temple rested on those two great pillars. But Samson wasn't thinking of his own survival. He wasn't focused on how many Philistines he could take down before the end. No, in this moment, Samson's only desire was to fulfill the will of God, even if it meant sacrificing his life. He reached out, placing his hands on the two pillars, the very same pillars that supported the temple, where the Philistine rulers were gathered to mock God's chosen judge. Samson's fingers trembled as he gripped the columns. In his weakened state, this act should have been impossible. His strength was gone, his body was broken. But as he pressed his hands harder against the pillars, something extraordinary began to happen. It wasn't his muscles that were moving those great columns. It was the power of God working through him. In that moment, Samson's faith was put to the test. He didn't know if he would survive this act or if the temple would collapse with him inside it. But he knew one thing for sure. He was doing exactly what God had called him to do. This wasn't about his glory. It was about fulfilling God's purpose for his life, no matter the cost. With a prayer on his lips, Samson pushed with everything he had left, and the earth began to tremble. The pillars cracked and groaned under the pressure. The temple shook, and with a final earth-shattering roar, the entire structure came crashing down. The walls crumbled, the ceiling collapsed, and the Philistines who mocked Samson fell to their deaths. But more importantly, in that moment, Samson fulfilled the purpose he was born for. In the end, his greatest victory wasn't the destruction of his enemies, it was his surrender to God's will. He had come full circle. Where once he had been a prideful man, now he was a humble servant, willing to die for the glory of God. Samson's death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of Israel's restoration. The Philistines had long oppressed God's people, but now, through Samson's ultimate sacrifice, the power of the enemy was broken. Samson's final act of faith and obedience left a lasting impact, one that would echo through the pages of history. We can learn so much from Samson's last act. It teaches us that no matter how far we've fallen, no matter how many mistakes we've made, God can still use us for His glory. Samson didn't end his life in the way he had imagined. But in the end, he fulfilled his purpose. His death was not a defeat, it was a victory. A victory won not by his strength but by his faith in the power of God. As we reflect on Samson's last stand, let's remember that true strength comes from surrendering to God's will. It's not about our abilities or talents, but about trusting in God to work through us even in our brokenness. Samson's greatest triumph wasn't in his strength, it was in his obedience, in his willingness to follow God's calling, even unto death. Samson's story is one that reverberates through the pages of the Bible, not only as a tale of personal triumph and failure, but also as a cautionary narrative for future generations. As one of the last judges of Israel, Samson's legacy is a mix of extraordinary feats of strength and tragic shortcomings in his character. His tale carries a powerful warning about the cost of strength without obedience and the consequences of relying solely on one's own abilities rather than on God's power. For generations, Samson's name became synonymous with power and defiance, but his downfall was not caused by his enemies or by the power he once wielded. Instead, it was his failure to submit to God's will that led to his downfall. His story serves as a stark reminder that strength, no matter how great, can only take us so far. Without the foundation of obedience to God, even the mightiest will fall. When Samson was first born, his parents were given a divine promise that he would deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. From the very beginning, his life was set apart for a divine purpose. But in his pride and self-reliance, Samson squandered much of the potential he had been given. He was a man who seemed to believe that his physical strength could overcome any challenge, but he was blind to the fact that true strength comes from a humble heart aligned with God's will. One of the biggest lessons we can learn from Samson is that our abilities, talents, and strength are not meant to be used for selfish purposes. Samson's failure to recognize this led him to make poor decisions that ultimately cost him everything: his sight, his freedom, and his life. His victory in his final moments did not come from his strength, but from his willingness to surrender to God. It was only when he was at his lowest point, his strength gone, his body broken, his eyes gouged out, that Samson understood the true source of his power. Samson's life also illustrates the danger of not heeding God's warnings. Time and time again, Samson was given opportunities to turn back, to change his ways, and to rely on God, but he chose to ignore those moments of divine intervention. His relationship with Delilah is a prime example. Samson's foolishness in trusting someone who was aligned with his enemies led to his ultimate betrayal. The loss of his strength and his capture by the Philistines were not merely the result of his physical weakness, but the culmination of his spiritual disobedience. This failure to live in obedience to God is a warning that resonates throughout the Bible and to us today. Samson's life shows us that no matter how gifted we are vulnerable without God's guidance. If we rely solely on our strength, intelligence, or charisma, we will inevitably face moments of defeat. It is only when we humble ourselves before God, recognizing that all our gifts are meant to serve His purposes, that we can achieve true success. Moreover, Samson's tragic fall demonstrates the importance of avoiding the distractions of this world. Samson was often distracted by his desires for women, especially Delilah, and that distraction led him to forsake his vows and break the covenant he had with God. This is another key warning from his story. The things of this world, while alluring, can pull us away from God's calling and purpose for our lives. Samson's inability to resist temptation cost him dearly, and it is something that we must take to heart in our own lives. Despite his failures, Samson's final act of obedience in bringing down the Philistine temple shows that God can still use us even in our weakest moments. Samson may have failed in many ways, but in his final prayer he acknowledged God's power and asked for the strength to defeat his enemies. God honored that prayer and used Samson's death to fulfill the purpose that had been set for him from birth. So what is Samson's legacy? It's not just about physical strength nor about a tragic hero who fell from grace. Samson's legacy is about the importance of obedience and humility before God. It's about recognizing that our strength and success come from God, and that we are called to live according to His will, not our own. Samson's life is a reminder that no matter how mighty we think we are nothing without God. His final act of surrender is what redeemed his life and allowed his story to end on a note of victory rather than defeat. As we reflect on Samson's life, let's remember that God has a purpose for each of us. Our strength may not come in the form of physical might like Samson's, but we all have a unique calling and purpose. Let's not waste it by relying on our own abilities, but instead, let us seek to align our lives with God's will, just as Samson ultimately did in his final moments. Samson's final prayer in the book of Judges stands as a powerful moment of redemption, showing the immense value of surrendering to God even at the lowest points in life. Throughout his life, Samson was a figure of incredible strength and potential, but his downfall came as a result of his disobedience, his disregard for the vows he had made, and his failure to recognize the source of his power. His final moments, however, present a beautiful contrast, as Samson turns to God in the midst of his defeat, seeking redemption and strength one last time. The scene is set as Samson is brought to the Philistine temple, blinded, mocked, and humiliated. His strength has been taken from him, his hair shaved and his once unmatched power reduced to nothing. But as he is led into the temple, something changes within him. It is in this moment of utter weakness and captivity that Samson finally understands that his strength was never his own, it was always a gift from God. This realization paves the way for his final prayer, a moment of deep humility and surrender before his Creator. Samson's prayer in Judges 16:28 is simple yet profound. He cries out to God saying, "Sovereign Lord, remember me, please God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." In this prayer, we see a man who has been humbled, who has faced the consequences of his actions and who now recognizes that only God can give him the strength to fulfill his purpose. This final prayer is a stark contrast to the pride and arrogance that characterized much of Samson's earlier life. For much of his journey, he relied on his physical strength and personal desires, often acting impulsively without regard for God's guidance. But in his final moments, Samson's heart is turned toward God in a way it had never been before. He acknowledges that his previous victories were not of his own doing, but were granted by God's mercy and power. It is only now, in his weakest state, that Samson comes to understand the true source of his strength. There's a profound lesson here for us all. Sometimes we go through life relying on our own strength and abilities, forgetting that it is God who gives us the power to succeed. Like Samson, we may reach a point where our strength fades, and we find ourselves facing difficult challenges or failures. It is at those moments of weakness that God is often closest, ready to restore us and give us the strength to carry on. Samson's final prayer teaches us that no matter how far we've fallen, God is always willing to forgive and restore us when we come to him with a humble and repentant heart. Samson's request for strength in his final prayer is not motivated by selfishness, but rather by a desire to fulfill the mission God had set for him. Even though he had failed in many ways, Samson still recognized that he had a divine purpose. He understood that his life had meaning, and he asked for one final opportunity to carry out God's will. This moment is a powerful reminder that God's plans for us are not dependent on our perfection or our success, but on his grace and mercy. No matter how many times we fail or fall short, God can still use us for his glory if we turn to him with humility and faith. Samson's prayer also highlights the importance of relying on God's power rather than our own. In our daily lives, it's easy to get caught up in the belief that we can handle everything on our own. We rely on our talents, our intelligence, or our resources to navigate life's challenges. But the story of Samson teaches us that true strength comes from God alone. It is not by our own might, but by his Spirit that we can overcome the obstacles in our path. In his final moments, Samson did not ask for wealth, fame, or personal glory. He asked for the strength to fulfill God's purpose. He wanted to take down the enemies of Israel, to make right the wrongs he had committed, and to honor God one last time. This act of surrender and humility is one of the most powerful moments in the entire biblical narrative, as it shows that no matter how great our mistakes or shortcomings may be, God is always willing to use us for His greater purpose if we are willing to surrender to Him. When Samson's final prayer is answered, and he is given the strength to bring down the Philistine temple, we witness the culmination of his life's purpose. In his death, Samson fulfills the mission God had set for him, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. It is a bittersweet victory, for Samson's death marks both the end of his life and the completion of the purpose for which he was born. But it also symbolizes the power of redemption that comes when we surrender our will to God, allowing Him to work through us, even in our brokenness. Samson's story doesn't end with his failure. It ends with his redemption. His final prayer is a reminder that God can always restore us, even when we feel we have fallen too far. No matter what we've done, no matter how many mistakes we've made, God is always ready to hear our prayers and give us the strength we need to fulfill His will. Samson's last stand may have come at the cost of his life, but in that sacrifice he found redemption, and through it he fulfilled his divine purpose. In the end, Samson's story teaches us that it is never too late to turn back to God, to seek His strength, and to fulfill the purpose He has for our lives. Samson's final prayer is a testament to the power of surrender and a reminder that true strength is not found in our abilities, but in our willingness to trust God with our lives. Samson's life, filled with strength and extraordinary gifts, stands as a powerful warning about the consequences of disobedience. From the beginning, Samson was set apart by God with a divine calling. His birth was foretold by an angel, and he was destined to be a judge of Israel, tasked with freeing the people from the oppression of the Philistines. Samson's potential was immense, but as we follow his journey, we see that despite his incredible strength, his life was marked by choices that led to his downfall. The story of Samson is not just about physical power, it is about the spiritual consequences of misusing God-given abilities. Samson was born with the Nazirite vow, a sacred commitment that required him to live a life of purity, free from the consumption of alcohol, the cutting of his hair, and the avoidance of contact with the dead. This vow symbolized his dedication to God, and it was the source of his strength. Yet time and time again, Samson disregarded these rules, seeking personal pleasures and indulging in his desires, rather than honoring his sacred commitment. 1. Of the most significant examples of Samson's disobedience was his relationship with Delilah, a woman whose loyalty to him was questionable at best. Despite several attempts by the Philistines to bribe Delilah into discovering the secret of Samson's strength, Samson continuously gave in to her persistence, revealing the truth about his Nazirite vow. In a moment of vulnerability and weakness, Samson shared the secret of his power, his uncut hair. This act of betrayal toward his calling was the pivotal moment that led to his capture by the Philistines. Samson's disobedience didn't just affect him, it had a ripple effect on those around him. His relationship with Delilah was built on a foundation of dishonesty and manipulation, ultimately leading to his downfall. By ignoring God's instructions and putting his trust in his own judgment, Samson opened himself up to betrayal and exploitation. He failed to recognize that the very strength that he relied on was a gift from God, and that he needed to maintain his spiritual discipline in order to continue fulfilling his purpose. His lack of obedience resulted in physical weakness and spiritual blindness, both literally and figuratively. The loss of his strength was not just the loss of his physical abilities, but also the loss of his connection with God. Samson's life demonstrates that disobedience doesn't just have immediate consequences. It also leads to a long-term disconnect from the very source of our strength. Just as Samson's hair was shaved and he became weak, our spiritual lives become weak when we neglect our relationship with God and disregard His commandments. Disobedience, whether in small or large ways, creates a barrier between us and the power that God desires to give us. In Samson's case, the consequences were severe. His physical strength was taken from him, but perhaps more painfully, his calling as a judge of Israel was left unfulfilled. The Israelites were left without the leader they needed, and Samson himself was reduced to a prisoner, a shadow of the man he once was. He had the potential to deliver his people, to fulfill the destiny God had for him, but his disobedience prevented him from achieving that. Samson's story is a stark reminder that disobedience to God's commands limits our potential and prevents us from fully realizing the plans God has for our lives. However, while Samson's disobedience had catastrophic consequences, his story also offers us a glimpse of hope. Even though he lost so much, his final moments provide a message of redemption. Samson's eventual surrender to God in his final prayer for strength was a moment of true humility. It was a recognition that his strength had always been a gift from God, and in his final act of obedience, he fulfilled his purpose. His story demonstrates that while disobedience can derail our plans and lead to devastating consequences, it is never too late to return to God, seek his forgiveness, and experience restoration. Samson's life also illustrates the tension between human potential and human failure. God had given Samson everything he needed to succeed: strength, intelligence, and a clear calling. But Samson's repeated failure to submit to God's will and his constant pursuit of self-gratification led to his downfall. This contrast highlights a crucial point. Even with great potential, we are not guaranteed success if we do not align ourselves with God's will. Strength alone is not enough. Obedience and humility are necessary to fulfill the purpose that God has designed for us. The consequences of Samson's disobedience serve as a warning to all of us. While God has given us unique gifts and abilities, he also calls us to live in obedience to him. Disobedience can take many forms, whether through deliberate sin, neglecting God's word, or simply choosing to follow our own desires instead of his guidance. The results of disobedience are always harmful. It leads to spiritual weakness, broken relationships, and unfulfilled potential. Samson's story reminds us that our strength is not our own. It comes from God, and it is sustained by our faithfulness and obedience to him. Yet, despite the consequences of Samson's disobedience, his story is not one of hopelessness. Even in his weakest moments, God was still able to use Samson for his purposes. His final act of obedience brought victory over the Philistines and was a reminder that God's plans are greater than our mistakes. No matter how far we fall, God can still redeem us and use us for his glory if we turn back to him in repentance and humility. Samson's life is a powerful testimony to the importance of obedience to God. His gifts, his strength, and his potential were all tied to his relationship with God. When he obeyed God's commands, he experienced extraordinary success. But when he chose to go his own way, he lost everything. The price of disobedience was high, but the message of redemption that comes from surrendering to God is even more powerful. It's never too late to turn back to God, and through obedience, we can fulfill the potential he has given us. As we come to the final chapter of Samson's life, we witness one of the most powerful moments in his story, his final prayer. This was a prayer of humility, repentance, and a return to the very purpose God had set for him. Samson's story had been one of strength, pride, disobedience, and loss. But in his last moments, he experienced a dramatic shift, acknowledging that his true strength was not in himself, but in the God who had given it to him. This moment of surrender would be his last act, and it would fulfill God's purpose for him, even in the face of death. Samson had spent much of his life relying on his physical strength to achieve his goals. He had made impulsive decisions, often disregarding God's commands, leading him into dangerous situations. Yet, despite all of his mistakes, God had not abandoned him. He had allowed Samson to experience the consequences of his disobedience, but even in his weakness, God was still present. The strength Samson once took for granted had left him, and now he was weak, captured, and blind. But it was in this state of vulnerability that Samson truly understood the source of his power. It was never about his muscles or his abilities. It was always about God. Samson's final prayer, spoken from the depths of his weakness, was a profound moment of reconciliation. In Judges 16:28, Samson cries out, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." This prayer was not just a request for physical strength. It was an acknowledgement that Samson was returning to God's will. He was asking for one final opportunity to fulfill the purpose God had set for him, even though he knew he had failed in so many ways. His plea was not for personal glory or for revenge out of bitterness. It was a humble cry for redemption, for the chance to complete the mission God had assigned to him. The beauty of this moment lies in the fact that Samson, despite his failures, was still able to call on God. His disobedience had cost him dearly, his strength, his sight, and his freedom. Yet in his most desperate hour, Samson's connection to God remained intact. This reminds us that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is still available to us. He is always ready to hear our prayers, even when we feel unworthy. Samson's final prayer teaches us that humility and repentance are powerful tools in restoring our relationship with God. When we surrender our pride and admit our need for His help, He is faithful to answer. In Samson's prayer, we see the concept of God's mercy and the opportunity for redemption. It was not too late for Samson to fulfill the purpose God had for him, even though his past was filled with mistakes. God was still willing to use Samson, despite his failures, to bring about His plan. Samson's story is a reminder that God can use anyone regardless of their past to accomplish great things for His kingdom. All it takes is a willing heart and a surrender to His will. When Samson prayed for strength, it was not just about his physical power returning, it was about him aligning his heart with God's purpose once again. This was a moment of spiritual renewal. Samson's strength had never been his own, it had always been a gift from God. His hair, which had been the outward symbol of his Nazirite vow, represented his consecration to God. When his hair was cut, it was a sign of his disobedience, and when it began to grow back, it symbolized his return to God. Samson's final prayer was an acknowledgement that his strength, both physical and spiritual, came from God alone. God, in His mercy, answered Samson's prayer. The Bible tells us that the Philistines had gathered in the temple of Dagon to celebrate their victory over Samson, and they placed him between two pillars. As Samson stood between those pillars, he called out to God one last time, asking for strength to bring down the house upon his enemies. God granted his request, and with one final act of strength, Samson pushed apart the pillars, causing the temple to collapse, killing more Philistines in that moment than he had killed throughout his entire life. This final act of Samson's was both tragic and triumphant. It was tragic because it was a violent and destructive end to his life, but it was also triumphant because it marked the fulfillment of his purpose. Samson's death was not in vain. God used him to strike a decisive blow against the Philistines, and in that moment, Samson was able to fulfill his calling as a judge of Israel, even in the face of death. His final act was a reminder that God's purposes can still be fulfilled, even when we think it's too late, and even when we have failed in the past. Samson's final prayer is an example of the power of redemption and the grace of God. No matter how far we stray, we can always return to God. His mercy is limitless, and He is always willing to forgive and restore us when we repent and turn back to Him. Samson's life was one of highs and lows, but in his last moments he found redemption. His final prayer shows us that it is never too late to turn back to God, to ask for strength, and to fulfill the purpose He has for us. Samson's last stand was not just about physical strength, it was about spiritual humility and obedience. His story teaches us that the true strength we possess comes from our relationship with God. It is only through Him that we can fulfill our purpose and experience true victory. Samson's final prayer reminds us that no matter our mistakes, God's grace is always available to us, and it's never too late to align ourselves with His will. When we do, we can experience His strength and fulfillment, just as Samson did in his final moments.